So why and how do we celebrate here in Albany, New York, where it is definitely not Mexico? It is not even in our Southwest, where communities have come to celebrate this festival that is a blend of an ancient Aztec celebration and the Catholic holy days that are coming up of All Saints and All Souls Day on November 1st and 2nd. And even Halloween, my Celtic roots. I have a picture of my mother's line, that Irish line here, of my great-grandmother and my grandmother. I'm wearing my grandmother's necklace. Halloween, All Hallows Eve, is one of those holidays also that is alongside Samhain, with the Gaelic word. But instead of warding off the ghosts and the spirits by wearing costumes and making loud noises and building bonfires like my ancestors did, families in Mexico invite their loved ones back home with photos, with stories, with favorite foods, with those treasured mementos that we can see up here on our own little ofrenda. And so we, with, I hope, gratitude, borrow this tradition as a reminder to us of how do we keep alive the stories of our ancestors, of our heritage, of our ancestors, whether we knew any of them or not. I may have mentioned before, I have a dear friend from my seminary days who, in a day of celebrating and really honoring our ancestors, her heart felt broken in a way that we had not recognized immediately, because she said, I was adopted. I don't know my ancestors in that way. I don't know those family stories. I know beautiful stories from the family that is my family that raised me. But I feel like I have this hole. And somebody in the class said, but your ancestors know you. And you have these two strands of ancestors who know you. So it is this blending of traditions, but I also love that it commemorates death as another element of life. And it's a way to remember and honor those loved ones. But it also is that recognition that death, that big change that many of us don't want to think about our own coming, or to picture, or to deal with, or to feel the grief that comes when we lose someone we love. Our culture gets really uptight about, we've got the stages of grief, check, check, check. Okay, work through that one, I'm done. Or we watch somebody going through those stages and think, why aren't they through that yet? It sure is taking them a long time to get back to normal. I have a little excerpt from an article in Sojourners magazine. Dia de Muertos reminds Christians to grieve, written by Sandy Oval Martinez. And she says, I'm not interested in a commercialized version of Dia de Muertos. Parades, concerts, and celebrations where I must buy a ticket are an invention of capitalism. I am interested in the family remembrance rituals, in the nights at the cemetery, communing with loved ones, in the ofrendas set up in homes, schools, public plazas, and then talking about the rituals around her family's remembrance of her abuelita, her grandmother. Part of our grief was continuing to express love that we did not get to give. Dia de Muertos is another opportunity to nourish the relationships we hold dearly. Grief is a way of expressing continuously the love we did not get to give when that beloved was with us in person. It is not something to get through. It is something that weaves through us. And as we remember those beloveds and say yes to how that grief will work in us and through us, we make space for compassion. We make space for peace of mind. We make space for those ancestors that we may need to forgive, and for those generations ahead of us that may beg us for forgiveness for why we didn't live our sacred calling. And Dia de Muertes is more than a personal remembrance. Martinez writes also that Dia de Muertos can have a prophetic touch, shedding light on the horrors of current events, reminding the rich, powerful, and abusive that death is our common experience. In Mexico, calaveritas do just that, satirical poems that are written every year around this time to express what is wrong with the status quo. And so, like when we come together every week, it is our own personal journey, our spiritual journey that we're feeding. But we do that communally because that is an important aspect of this too. It is not my own enlightenment that I seek. I am here as an expression of God. You are here as an expression of God for each other. And for all of those each others that we have not yet met. And so our remembrance leads us to grief. And so that second strand, we grieve. In the book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Francis Weller, he writes about the gates of sorrow. The third gate is the sorrows of the world. And this gate of grief, he writes, opens when we register the losses of the world around us. Whether or not we consciously recognize that this daily diminishment of species, habitats, and cultures is noted in our psyches. Much of the grief we carry is not personal, but shared, communal. It is difficult to walk down the street and not feel the collective sorrows, or to turn on the news. It is almost impossible not to feel the collective sorrows. It takes everything we have to deny the sorrows of the world. It takes a lot of our energy to not look. He quotes psychologist Chellis Glendinning in what she calls earth grief, that our job is to open our hearts to the sad history of humanity and the devastated state of the earth as the next step in our reclamation, in reclaiming our bodies, the body of our human community, and the body of the earth. The cumulative grief of the world can feel overwhelming. Am I uplifting you yet? Don't worry, I'm going to get there. But first, the fifth gate of sorrow is ancestral grief. This is the grief we carry in our bodies from the sorrows experienced by our ancestors. And much of this grief lingers in a layer of silence unacknowledged. know that here in our country, the legacy, even if you are Irish and German like me, it's a legacy of people who left their homes, who left their traditions, their old ways that connected them to their ancestors. And then we have the legacy of genocide of native populations, of genocide of people that are enslaved. We have how that trajectory plays out in 2023 here, and we have that collective human sorrow of the ancestors at what is happening in Gaza, in Israel, in Ukraine, in Syria, you name it. The collective sorrows of the world and the collective sorrows of the ancestors are calling us into the collective soul, where we live, but where we remain blind. So we remember, we grieve, and we don't stay there. But we let that remembrance and that deep, deep grief call us forth into the path that God has for us. And so the third strand is love. And it is not, as I said last week, it is not sentimental love. We are not talking about the Hallmark Channel here. We are talking about an elemental love. Something that calls forth from our soul the way we are meant to live together. So for these weeks that we have been reading this book, many of us in a membership class, the Unity Principles, exploring this teaching. This week's homework is Principle 5. Embracing God. Living as God. Expressing as God. Ellen Davenport writes about the principle in this way. She describes it like this. Knowing and understanding the laws of life are not enough. A person must live that truth that he or she knows. We know that. Those first four principles are to get us primed, to recognize that as we shift our consciousness into the truth that God is everywhere present, that not only are we made of God, so are those that we would call enemy. So are those that we would call other. And we are continuously co-creating with God in every moment. And so as we align our broken open hearts, our thoughts, our affirmations, with the heart of God, we listen. And so then we can embody that divine within us. Davenport writes, when we are living the truth, any action we take will be from a consciousness of spirit and oneness, with ego in service to the soul. We don't have to break our ego to bits. We just have to recognize that our ego is in service to our soul, our highest calling. Any action that feels forced, impulsive, or emotional is likely not to be in principle. Acting in principle usually brings a reassuring sense of being on the right track, even if others object. It is not stubbornly exerting our will, but it might be moving to the beat of our own drum. Putting principle into action, she continues, starts as an inside job. Heather's beautiful sharing of the peace prayer. To bring peace into the world, we have to be instruments of peace. And we can't only do that once in a while. It's why we need each other. And to be peaceful beyond where it is easy for us to be peaceful, right? Looking around here, it would be really easy to say, I can be peace. Look at these beautiful faces. I am so peace. Got it. And then we leave here. Do we still got it? And at a deeper level, can we practice seeing the divine beyond our own comfort zone in those that we would see as enemy and as other? And can we take time aligning ourselves in prayer, in quiet, in community, to let God flow through us? What is mine to do will look different than what is yours to do. How we are called to live into our sacred purpose is as varied as our beautiful Kathleen and her love of hats and dancing and good-looking, intelligent men. And Isabel, who lived a life of service in a very different way than Kathleen could, but they were called by God into the fullness of their beings, as we are. And so we braid those strands together, and we remember that goodness, love, God, the great open door, is the ultimate reality and the ultimate power at work in us and as us. And while we recognize the evils of the world and we pluck the splinter out of our own eye at our own errors, we know that if we don't see that as human error, we think it is inevitable, and it is not inevitable. It is not inevitable. And we remember that living that truth, that there is no separation between us, between those we see doing grave harm here and elsewhere, and those working for justice, that calls us to the elemental love that sometimes requires a whole lot from us. We grieve, we weep at the violence around the world, and we look into our own hearts. We practice forgiving and forgiving and forgiving and forgiving and healing of our ancestral wounds as part of our gift to transform the generations to come. We align our hearts and minds and souls with the immanent and transcendent presence of God. And in that stillness, in the grace and the quiet that we must come to, we listen. We listen for wisdom to know what is mine to do. We listen to the news and hold the high watch for peace, for justice. And we deny the power of either or, limited thinking, and our reactions that can get stuck there. And we love. Our commitment as a community is to hold our vision of a world transformed. And in this community, every week we affirm that. And we hold on to each other and we affirm for each other that we've got this. It is not always easy to live that simple truth that there is only love. And so we have each other. We gather to support and nourish and affirm each other in our journey. And so it is.
So it is.